Welcome to episode 235 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelt out, seven-health.com/235. Just a note before we get started, I'm currently taking on new clients. I have just 2 spots available. I specialize in helping clients overcome eating disorders and disordered eating, chronic dieting, body dissatisfaction and negative body image, over-exercise or exercise compulsion, or dealing with irregular cycles or cycles that have ceased altogether. If these are areas that you struggle with and like to make a thing of the past, then please get in contact. You can head over to seven-health.com/help, and there you can read about how I work with clients and apply for a free initial chat. And the address again is seven-health.com/help, and I'll also include it in the show notes. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist who specializes in recovery from disordered eating and eating disorders, or really just helping anyone who has a messy relationship with food and body and exercise. And this week on the show, it is a guest episode, and my guest today is Sarah Salmon. So Sarah is a coach, an introvert, a homebody, an INFJ, a brain tumor survivor, a nutritionist, a TEDx talker, and a highly sensitive person. And she specializes in helping overwhelmed introverts get their energy back. So I first became aware of Sarah when watching her TEDx talk, where she talked about how getting a brain tumor changed the course of her life and actually for the better. I then heard her on Summer Inanen's podcast talking about the work she's now doing with introverts. And these were both areas that I thought I'd love to be able to chat with Sarah about. And so I invited her on the show. With this interview, I had a lot less time than usual. It's amazing now because I'm so used to having 2 hours that when it's an hour or so, it's incredible with how quickly the time passes by. But we did get to cover a lot in the limited time. One of the areas we touch on as part of this conversation is highly sensitive people, or HSPs, and I forgot to mention it during the show, but this is something that I've covered before, and if it's of interest to you, then please check out episode 190, where I interviewed Barbara Allen all about the topic of HSPs. I think it's a great companion episode to this one. So let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Sarah Salmon. Hey, Sarah, thanks for joining me on Real Health Radio today.
Hey, Chris, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be chatting with you. I remember watching your TEDx talk and thinking I really need to have this person on the show. So glad that it's now happening. And there's 2 main areas that I want to cover today. So the first is about being a brain tumor survivor that you are, and how this experience changed you and continues to change your life. And I know this was a big part of your TEDx talk, and I'd love to share this with the listeners. And then the second part is about you as a coach and the work that you do. And I know previously this was helping women after recovery from major illness and helping with like post-traumatic growth and the experience that accompanies that. And then more recently, you've shifted your focus to working with introverts and helping introverts to live and thrive in a world that often feels like it's in opposition to their health and happiness and well-being. So yeah, that's what I'm hoping to cover, but I want this to be a conversation, so I'm happy for it to go off in other directions and tangents and wherever we need to go. So yeah,
we'll
how does that sound?
Yeah, sounds great.
So yeah, to start off with, do you want to give listeners just a bit of background on yourself, who you are, what you do, what training you've done, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so I am a coach, as Chris mentioned. I specifically coach introverts, and I'm sure we'll get more into that, but I am basically trained as a coactive coach, and I also use a lot of my past career as a graphic designer, where I have 15 years working as a graphic designer in leadership positions, so a lot of like brainstorming skills and problem solving skills. So all of that comes into the work that I do now. But my backstory is more that I started out my career as a graphic designer, and I knew I wanted to do that when I was 16. So the context of this story is that even when we're kids, we know what we want to do, but of course we're still growing and evolving, and we always change. So I started as a graphic designer, and then this whole brain tumor thing happened, which I'm sure we'll get into, as you mentioned, and that completely changed everything. And I quit my 6-figure career after that because I was like, and we'll get into this, but I quit my 6-figure career, went back to school, studied nutrition. I was nutrition coaching for a long time, and then that evolved into kind of the story where you picked up there. So that's my basic background, but I could talk about it for a long time. So
yeah, I can then start with that, and I'll go through different bits. I saw as part of your bio, did you studied graphic design at University of Bournemouth in the UK?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I grew up on Guernsey, actually, and then I did all my school, university, and on the mainland in the UK.
Okay, fine. That was, I wanted to find out if you were originally from here or from in Canada.
I'm a dual. Technically, I'm from Canada, but I grew up in the UK.
Okay, cool. Yeah, Bournemouth is a lovely place. I was recently down there a couple of weeks ago in the New Forest for a holiday, and it is just such a beautiful part of the UK with lovely beaches, and I think probably the best weather of anywhere in the UK. So yeah, it's a nice spot to do university.
Yes, understatement.
And so with the graphic design, it sounds like obviously the brain tumor was the thing that allowed you to say, okay, this isn't the career path that I wanted to be on. Mm. But yeah, how long were you enjoying the graphic design, and when did those thoughts start to creep in? Was it really just with the brain tumor?
Well, I mean, I think we all go through ebbs and flows in jobs and careers. As a designer, I had worked with really big brands like Dell and Mercedes-Benz and Harley-Davidson and big banks that I'm under NDAs and can't talk about, and big global banking. And like before I discovered that I was in this health situation, I was working with a big banking client that I didn't love just because of the bureaucracy in the organization. And then a lot of the things that I was being asked to do. And I was kind of like, there was a sense of dis-ease around it. Dis-ease. Sure. So ironic. There was, this disquiet around it where I was just like, this isn't sitting right. But it also was a client that I just didn't like, knowing that I had liked my previous clients and knowing that I liked other clients that were in the office at the time. So I kind of went into this whole phase of my life where I discovered I had a brain tumor and all of what that entailed, with a sense that I don't like my current client, and I had been working with them for a year already, and I was always looking for a way out. So I was primed and ready.
but probably not for that as the way out. But yeah.
I was kind of trying to extract myself from that client and to move to another one, or I was, but I was also equally accepting it. Like I wasn't working that hard at getting out. There were some opportunities around it that were allowing me to transition out of design into more account management. And so I was kind of working on that too. So that was kind of trying to look on the bright side, whilst also accepting that there was a lot of things about this that just weren't feeling right to me. But at the time, I didn't really have that self-awareness to be like, this feeling that I have is valid.
Yeah.
It kind of was at that point in my life where I had to be a little bit more literal, and, my boss has to be a horrible person, or the client, it had to be more obvious. I wasn't really tuned in that way yet.
Yeah. And so, how did the diagnosis come about? What symptoms were you getting that led to you visiting the doctor's office?
Oh, well, it's so interesting because I had only just moved to Toronto, and I had moved from Calgary. So in Canada, when you move from one province to the other, you get a new healthcare card, just because those things are managed provincially rather than nationally. And so I didn't even have my new healthcare card yet. I was still working off of my old one. And so I didn't even have a doctor yet. And I was a runner at the time, like running half marathons. And so when I go out for a run, I felt like I was kind of imbalanced.
Yeah.
Like my left foot was scuffing. And then the weirdest thing happened. When you like walk into a room and say it's in the middle of the night, but where the light switch is. So you just like put your hand back behind you and flip the light switch, right? You don't even need to look at it. You just know where it is. Yeah. And so I did that, and I turned the light on, but I couldn't feel myself turning the light on. Like my hands are working, but not the sensation of feeling the touch of the light switch and the movement and the result of that. And so I had that happening and my foot was scuffing. And then the final straw before I went to the doctor was that I was in a busy bar and I was talking to friends and I was talking, when you've had a few drinks, you tend to gesticulate a little bit more. And then something hit my hand and I was just like, what is that? Who's in my space? Like I'm very protective of my personal space.
Yeah.
And like something like whacks my hand and I'm just like got instantly so annoyed because that's my go-to in that situation. And then I realized, oh my God, that was me. It was my other hand. And so that's when, okay, maybe I should go see the doctor. There's something weird going on here.
And were you really concerned or freaked out at that stage? Or are you like, it's fine, this is like, what was your initial thoughts?
I mean, my approach is always very like lighthearted, jokey. Okay. So, I just had to go to a walk-in doctor's. I don't know if you have them there where you don't have an appointment, you just show up if you don't have a doctor.
Yeah, not sure. I mean, possibly before a pandemic.
Right.
Not sure now.
Definitely a whole nother world. Yeah. So I went to the walk-in clinic, which means that you basically go and you show up and you just have to sit in line and wait and you see whichever doctor is there and available. Yeah. And when I was leaving work, I was like, oh, it's just probably something in my head. You all know that I'm crazy, which is a language that I don't use now. But so we're all like joking and laughing. And then I got to the doctor and he's like, well, hopefully it's not something like a neurological condition. And so he said, I'm just going to book you in for a CT scan. And it's like, hopefully it's nothing. But the good thing about walk-in doctors here is that very often they're very paranoid because they don't have your medical history or anything in front of them. Yeah. So they tend to over test, which can be a good thing as it was in my scenario. So I went for this CT scan and the lady at the tech was like, so they'll probably get back to you in like a week and they'll let you know what's going on. The next day they phoned me and they're like, you need to go see your doctor. So I went in to see this walk-in doctor again. And he goes, so it looks like you have a lesion on your brain. And I don't know, like Chris, if someone said you have a lesion, what does that mean to you?
Considering you added then on your brain, it would probably have more of an impact.
Yeah, like for me, like lesion wasn't really alarm bells just yet.
Right.
Like to me, a lesion is a bit like a blister. Yeah. Maybe like a boil. I don't know. Yeah. So that me in my uneducated medical sense. And I was like, okay. And then by the end of this 10-minute conversation, it had evolved into a tumor. And I'm like, hang on a second, you just said this was a lesion. And that's kind of where it all began. And very quickly, like the next week I had a neurosurgeon and then I had a surgery appointment, the craniotomy, to have it removed. But the thing was very interesting that is not in my TED Talk is that all the doctors, including the neurosurgeon, were like, okay, this is so weird. Like your symptoms don't align with where the tumor is. It doesn't make any sense. Oh, God. Turned out the tumor was actually asymptomatic. Like I would never have found it. So my neurosurgeon actually booked me in for an MRI because, as you may know, CT scans don't show everything. MRIs show different things in the brain. Yeah. But it was 6 months after my surgery. Like, because it's hard to get get an MRI here. You can wait a long time. And I just had, despite the fact that I wasn't loving my work, I had the most incredible boss at work. And she's like, no, this isn't good enough. I'm going to pay personally for you to go down to the States and have an MRI scan. So because Toronto's only like a 2-hour drive from the border. Yeah. So a lot of people would drive down to Buffalo and get medical testing and stuff done quicker. So I did that. And then that showed actually that I had demyelination as well, which is basically MS, multiple sclerosis. Right. So in the same week, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor and multiple sclerosis. So, that was just one of those weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the MS I just put aside and I asked my neurosurgeon to refer me to the best neurologist that he knew, which is his buddy down the corridor. So that was all fine. And then I had surgery a few weeks later to have it removed.
And what what was the prognosis, or what were the odds that they were giving you as part of having the tumor and having it removed? Did you go into surgery feeling fairly confident?
Oh, well, it was a kind of, it was not considered a cancerous tumor.
Yeah.
But when you have a brain tumor, it's never really considered benign, because a mass in your head is never benign. It's always going to have some kind of impact on your functioning.
Yeah.
And so people who have had the same kind of tumor as me can lose their eyesight. They can completely change their personality. It just depends on where it is in the brain as to the impact that it has. So I was very lucky that I also had these symptoms that were coming from what was the MS actually, and that the tumor was, I mean, it was the size of a golf ball in my head, but it could have grown to be the size of a grapefruit and then completely changed my personality. And I could have lost my vision and all sorts. So it was like the universe had my back in a very strange way.
Yeah.
So going into surgery, I mean, I had never been in hospital before. I'd never even had the flu before. I was just, like a healthy 30-year-old, 31-year-old. And also I thought, who knows what's going on in your body at any given time.
Yeah.
And I mean, I was absolutely terrified, because I met with this neurosurgeon once before, and he just was describing to me how we're going to make a cut like this in your head. And he's just like drawing with his finger, this big line around my head. And I was like, well, I just met you. Like, I feel like we should know each other a bit better before we do this. This is very intimate. You're going to touch my brain. So it just was very much like I had nothing to equate this to. It was very trippy for me. And so going into surgery was terrifying, because and I haven't really been under anesthesia that much, but that is always the scariest part for me, is the anesthesia part and not being in control and not knowing what's going on. So that is always the scariest part of when they're asking you to count down.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, well, who knows what happens now if I wake up. I mean, obviously I did wake up, but I woke up in neuro ICU, and you have, I had like 4 or 5 IVs and different things going into my arms, and I had tubes coming out of my scalp and massive bandage on, and I couldn't lift my head up, and it was just, I don't know, just wild.
Yeah. No, well, I imagine knowing going in that this could mean that you can't, like, it affects your eyesight or it affects all these areas of the body. You're waking up after major surgery and not being able to lift your head very much, and really not knowing how has this gone.
Yeah. And you don't know. And then until the doctor comes around with all his medical students, and they all kind of scurry around your bed and like, oh, this is the patient who I told you about who has blah, blah, blah syndrome. And I was just like, in my mind, I don't even remember what he was saying, but you become a teaching piece as well. Yeah. And meanwhile, you're just completely out of it, because as well, the nurses come every hour on the hour, no matter what time of day or night, and do like neurological checks on you. So they flash lights in your eyes, and they ask you to do this, and can you feel your toes, and lift your arms up over your head. And it's just to make sure that there's, no complications.
Yeah.
But the big complication that I had was that, and I didn't realize for maybe a week, is that I lost my sense of smell, which is very interesting in these times. But yeah. I completely lost my...
come back, or that's now permanently?
No,
then you've lost it.
I haven't had it since for 10, 11, 12 years. But what I did have was these weird, they're called olfactory hallucinations, which means that you smell things that are not really there. It's a bit like when an amputee feels the limb that was amputated.
Yeah.
So I would get that. But at that time, at first, I was just smelling, like one of my go-to hallucinations I would have would be a chemically smell. And that's just happened to be what I was smelling in the hospital. So I just thought that's what hospitals smell like, until I got home and couldn't smell strawberries, for example. I'm like, hang on a second. There's something weird going on here. To be honest, now it's a good thing. Like, I go into public washrooms and they're perfectly clean. So yeah.
And so what was your recovery like? How long did it take to get back to feeling normal or new normal?
I would say to have my whole life in place again was a whole year. I had very good benefits at work. So I'm coming from a North American perspective here, of course, in that regard, but we have a nationalized health system, a bit like the NHS, but then we also have private insurance at work.
Yeah.
That gives you extra things. So I had very good insurance through work that covered my full salary for 3 months, and then it would have been supplementary after that. So I had a full 3 months off work, and because I couldn't go anywhere that was busy, if you imagine all of the stimuli that come in at you at any given time, it can be like it can be touch, it can be sound, it's the things you see, it's the things that you're tasting, it's text, like it's all sorts of things that are being hundreds of thousands of things thrown at you every single day. And your brain just picks and chooses what it allows through to your consciousness. And this is just my language. I don't have the technical terms for this, but my brain had no way of filtering anymore. Like it just allowed everything in. So if I went for a walk with my dog, I couldn't also watch TV for 2 hours. So it was a bit of a situation at first, like being a spoonie, where you only have so much energy and you have to divvy it out in the day.
Yeah.
And it was, so if I had a friend come over to see me, they had to sit down next to me. They had to speak very softly. They couldn't use their hands a lot to talk. They couldn't walk and talk because I could only take in so much at one time, which I'm sure we'll get to, had a really interesting impact on my self-awareness and my introversion and my sense of being like a highly sensitive person as well. Like it really exaggerated all of those things for me.
Yeah.
And there was just one time in Toronto, there's this incredible farmers market called St. Lawrence Market. And it's just in this beautiful Victorian building, jam-packed with stands, and it's always super busy and a thriving place. And so it was one of my favorite places to go. So maybe a month after my surgery, I went there. I had a hat on my head because I had like a massive scar in my hair. And so we went there, and it was like being in a movie and the camera is like spinning around you faster and faster, like all of these thousands and thousands of inputs coming in at once. And I literally lasted 5 minutes. I'm like, I have to get out of here. I can't be here. I went home and slept for 3 hours just from that 5 minutes. So I was off work for 3 whole months. And then I slowly started going back to work. I started with a 4-hour work week where I just did 4 hours in the morning, and then an 8-hour work week, which was 2 4-hour mornings, and slowly building up over 3-4 months back to full time. And then even then I could, before I went back to work, I was like exercising. I was, going for long walks with my dog. I was doing some gentle stuff in the gym. But then when I went back to work, that I didn't have the energy to do that. That energy had to go into work.
Yeah.
And then so it took a full year to get back, working, exercising, having friends, like going out and having friends. And it took all that time to get all of those things back into place, like your full life.
Wow. And was it then because of that year-long experience, as well as probably the shattering of invincibility that we have at that age because of having the brain tumor, that meant that you started to really reflect upon your life and the direction it was going? And is this how I want to spend my time and my days?
Yeah, like, first of all, it really was a wake-up call around self-awareness and just what is going on in my body, how am I feeling, just because I realized I only had so much energy that I had to like really notice my energy levels and how I was feeling, and then divvy it out appropriately. Like, okay, what am I making a choice? Where am I going to spend this energy, so to speak? So it really brought a self-awareness around that kind of body sensations and energy in that perspective. But then also there was it was 2 days after I got home from hospital, just 2 days. And I was like, well, I can't do this job anymore. I can't be in this career anymore. And not because I couldn't physically do it in that moment because I was, recovering from brain surgery, but because I was like, the work that I'm doing does not align with my values. Like, I just had this epiphany. I realized what this kind of sense of kind of dis-ease and it's just so funny. I keep using that word, right? It's just so ironic. But that's what, like, I realized I was able to kind of articulate what it was. Like, it's that I'm working for this big bank as a client, and we're putting fine print on, pages that sell people credit cards that will ultimately really screw people over if they default on their payments for 3 months.
Yeah.
Which every single person has gone through a time in their life where, they have to put off their credit card payment, and they just get a little bit extra interest. But it was just like, this does not feel good to me. And it was also at a time when there was a big crackdown on giving people credit limits in North America, because they, just like the whole housing crash, had been giving people credit limits that were not proportionate to their income and their ability to pay it off.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this fine print is really going to screw people over in a really bad way. And it just wasn't feeling good to me. And it just really just encapsulated my whole problem with where my career had gotten to, which was, I am using my many, many years of experience to help big corporations get richer.
Yeah.
And I can't do this anymore. So I also knew that I shouldn't be making any big decisions in the next year, because I've gone through something big and traumatic. And I had Googled that you should not make any big decisions for a while.
Yeah.
But this was brewing in my head. And so I used and abused my health benefits. So I got back to work and I got everything in place. And within like a year and a bit, I had this meeting with my client. And the bureaucracy in huge organizations is such that as a designer, you are working with your clients, but they report to the person above them, who reports to 5 other people above them, like this whole chain of people. And the whole project just fell apart because they had not communicated properly within their own organization. And I literally left that meeting, grabbed my boss, pulled her into a meeting room and said, I can't do this anymore, I quit. And that was it. I didn't tell my husband. I didn't tell anyone. I'm just like, that was the moment where it all came full circle. I'm like, I'm done with this.
And at that stage, did you know, okay, I want to go into coaching? Like, had you figured that piece out, or you're like, I just know that I don't want to do this part, and the other part I will figure out?
I knew in that moment that I didn't want to do that job anymore. I had serious doubts about my whole career, but I knew that job, I had to get out of there right now. And it was the beginning of the summer, and I just decided I'm just going to take the summer off. I'll figure it out. I have lots of connections. So I did that. And by the end of the summer, I was picking up freelance work, and it wasn't a big deal. I was very lucky, which gave me some non-committal buffer career-wise to like figure out what I wanted to do. But meanwhile, like on another kind of track there, had started digging into the MS side of things and was paying attention to my nutrition around that, and had met with a doctor, and they had offered me medication, which is what they always do. And basically it's like, you're on medication for the rest of your life. And I didn't have any symptoms at the time, which the thing with MS is that you never really know, if you have a mild case, whether improvement in your symptoms is due to just the course of the disease or whether it's due to the medications. When you have a much more serious case, it's much clearer, and there's some very clear steps to take. So I decided not to take the medication, rightly or wrongly. I was young, and I was just like, I don't want to just jump on medication from a 5-minute conversation. That seems, again, like with a neurosurgeon, I'm like, we need to slow this down a bit. I need to figure things out for myself and process things. And then I ended up finding the autoimmune protocol, like the one that's aligned with like paleo and things like that. And did that. But I think that, and my symptoms never came back. And so I decided to never go on that medication. But I, at the time, was like, okay, there are other ways to do things. And so that's kind of what led me into ultimately studying nutrition. And because I was doing this freelance work as a designer that pays you an unethical amount of money, like ridiculous amount of money, I was able to take 2 years off work to do that.
Wow. That is a real gift.
Yeah, I am not blind to the fact that I was very lucky in that the kind of work that I was doing really set me up to make these decisions. It's not always that easy, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, my partner was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and that was shortly after my son was born. So it's probably like 3.5 years ago. And she also tried out the autoimmune diet, AIP, autoimmune paleo diet, and it did not have a beneficial impact for her. And so,
I think it's important as well to notice, is it the food or is it other things that I'm doing? Because my sense around it is that my life was heading in a direction that wasn't right for me, and I wasn't able to see it, or I didn't have the courage to do something about it.
Yep.
And so I don't want to sound flippant around people who are going through big things in their lives health-wise, but in hindsight, it felt like if these things hadn't happened to me, I would probably still be in a career that I didn't love. My health would not be where it is now. I would definitely be in a relationship that was not right for me. There's a lot of things that it did for me that probably I would not have had the courage to do before.
Definitely. And I so agree with that. And I think, I bet you wouldn't wish to go through all of that again. But I know loads of people talk about the fact that, hey, I think getting cancer and surviving was one of the best things that could have happened to me, or going through that bankruptcy and getting through it was one of the best things that could have happened to me, getting divorced, etc. And so these parts of life that are deeply unpleasurable and painful and tough, actually coming out the other side are in service of a better life, and you having more self-awareness and having a better understanding of how you want to spend your days on this planet. And so, I think that is true. I mean, even with the work that I do with eating disorders, I do think that it can be in many ways a gift if it can be seen in that way, and you can then learn through that experience of, okay, now I can learn other ways to cope. Now I can learn about things that have happened in my past that have had an impact on the way that I am. Like it can be something that gives you a reason to start exploring and doing the work, because otherwise, as you say, you can just cruise through life on autopilot, where it isn't actually that meaningful, and it isn't actually the life that you could have if there was a little more attention being paid.
Yeah, and it's just like there is another way to live life.
Yeah.
And like we end up in the life that we are from a whole host of influences. It's like the way we're brought up, the society that we're in. There's like so many influences that that when something big and bad and scary happens to you, it's never pleasant. It's never fun. I would never wish it on anyone. But the thing that comes out of it is so often you have this sense of self-awareness. And I feel like it gives you that self-awareness that allows you to opens your eyes to a whole host of things, and whichever direction you choose to step in or how it affects you is the most perfect thing for you in that moment. Like that's the thing that you needed.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you started working with clients in terms of, and I know you had a period where you were working with clients with chronic illness and going through major life change, did that just feel like a natural place to focus because of your own experience?
Well, when I started having qualified as a nutritionist, I opened up the classic nutrition practice, one-on-one, in person. I didn't work online at all. I was mainly working with people with autoimmune conditions and digestive complaints like IBS, like that classic doctor who says, oh, you have IBS. It's the catch-all diagnosis digestively, right? So I was helping people with that, and some mental health things here and there, like anxiety. I had one client with bipolar. So helping people in that regard. And I guess I should just add a caveat in here that I don't think nutrition can solve bipolar. That wasn't what it was about. We were helping balance her blood sugar and helping her have the right foods in her freezer for when she was going through a more of a depressive phase and things like that. So I just want to put that caveat in there for people. So I was doing that, but when I moved, one of the things that was a result of my brain tumor and that whole big awakening that I had was that I was living in downtown Toronto, but actually was a really outdoorsy person. And I was, so one of the big awakenings I have is that I'm living in the wrong place. And I actually ended up moving from Toronto to the far west coast of Canada to Vancouver Island, which is where I am now, living rurally on an acreage with horses all around and all sorts. But when I moved here, I just wasn't inspired to restart my nutrition practice. It just seemed like such a drag to me. And I realized that I had even more of a kind of awareness and did some more kind of education and realized that I was an introvert, and that the way that I had been working was actually very challenging for me. Like I was taking on a lot of people's energy. And so that was a whole nother layer of awareness and change, and that, okay, there are certain ways that I need to be in the world that are going to make me more successful. And I guess I should add in that when I was working as a nutritionist, I was also consulting in a health food store. So I was helping hundreds of people a day. Yeah. Which for some people there's nothing wrong with that job per se. Like many people thrive in it and do so well. And I thrived in it to a point where I had a lot of regulars who would come in and see me. Like people would line up to see me in the store. I would go to the washroom and people would be like clamoring around the door, waiting for me to come out. It was very claustrophobic and oppressive. And it was just like, that job burned me out so much, not because it was the job, but because I was an introvert and I was forced to be dealing with hundreds of people a day, and not just hundreds of people, but hundreds of people and their problems. Yeah. That you're trying to convince people who are looking for an easy option to actually take some responsibility for themselves and make decisions that are good for themselves in a 10-minute conversation, right? It was just, and that was kind of for me when I discovered that I was an introvert, and that this is why I'm so exhausted. And I actually had to step away from that as well, because it was a whole new awareness around how I could be successful, and it had to be in a way that worked for me as an introvert.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So I am an introvert as well, but I feel like there is definitely some differences between us. So I discovered I was an introvert probably more like around about when I was 30. So I lived in London until I was 30 or 31. And so it was then moving to the countryside that I really discovered that I was an introvert and enjoyed spending a lot of time on my own and out in the countryside. Or Ali, my wife, would be off riding a horse all day, and I would be perfectly okay in my own company. And when I reflect back on why it took so long to figure this out, was I was basically single all through my 20s. And so even though I was living in London during that time, I did get a lot of alone time, and I was never one for going out much midweek, and so I was always getting early nights and having time in on my own, or even on weekends. There'd be some weekends I'd do something, some weekends I wouldn't. And so I had sort of just naturally found that way of being, and partly because I was single during all that time. And I also think I'm probably not at the far end of the introvert end of the spectrum, so a little more towards the middle. I'm also not highly sensitive, a HSP, and this is something that I think would be useful for us to get into as well, because I think for a lot of people who are introverts, there is this overlap with being a highly sensitive person, and that's not that's not me. So I don't get stressed by violent movies or loud noises or repetitive noises. Like I spent a large part of my 20s in clubs and in venues with loud music and lots of people, and that doesn't overwhelm me. I mean, I don't want to do it every single day, but it doesn't overwhelm me in the moment to the point where like I have to get out of here. So I definitely know that I'm an introvert and I need more time alone to recharge, and I prefer having conversations more one-on-one, even if I'm in a group setting. But I don't have many of the other HSP type traits that often get talked about as part of being an introvert. And I think they kind of need to be separated out.
Yeah, for sure. But first of all, so interesting that before you even knew that this idea of being an introvert, that you were just going with the flow in that regard.
Yeah.
Because I think, you say you were single and you weren't really going out much on the weeknights, but someone who is more, so just to provide the context for everyone, introversion and extroversion are on a spectrum. So one on each end, and you fall somewhere on that. So you're never just one or the other, but you tend to be more of one than the other. But it's just so interesting that you naturally did that. Whereas I think that someone who is more on the extroverted end of that spectrum would actually be seeking to go out more often, because that's where they get their energy from.
Yeah.
Right. So they would have been going out after work every night for drinks. Like I was in London at that same time in my life, and that's what we did. And I don't know how I survived it, to be honest. I think I just went out after work and not on the weekends, because I just had a very social workplace. But
so I didn't. So I worked for local government and fell into a job that was then a very easy job. I then started a couple of years after moving to London, started studying on the weekends, and I had the most low stress job with lots of people who I didn't want to spend time with outside of work. And so it wasn't a work experience that meant that I was out at the pub with work colleagues all the time.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
And so, let's talk just to kind of sharpen up the HSP side. So how would you describe this?
Yeah, well, we first of all, we have to talk about what is introversion versus HSP. Sure. So for people who are not sure if they are an introvert or an extrovert, basically in the most simplistic terms, an introvert recharges on their own. So if you are at the end of a busy day, if you are more inclined just to go somewhere quiet on your own with fewer people, it's highly likely that you are introvert or on that side of the spectrum between introversion and extroversion. Yeah. If you're someone who loves to be around people and you gain a ton of energy from being around those people, it's more likely that you are an extrovert. But I just want to clarify one thing there, because my wording wasn't quite right, is that just because you're an introvert doesn't mean you dislike being around people. It means that you recharge on your own.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't mean that you're antisocial. It doesn't mean that you have social anxiety. It doesn't mean that you can't be loud and confident and lead a room at work or do big things in the world. It just means that you recharge on your own and that your nervous system is more sensitive to stimulation. So it's not just being around people, but if you're in a very hectic place, then that can be more tiring for you than a nice, calm, quiet place.
Yeah.
So that's like the basic thing there. And then we have this idea of being HSP, or being a highly sensitive person, which means, of which I think the statistic is something like, let's say 70% of HSPs are introverts.
Yeah.
As well. And then maybe the rest are extroverts. So extroverts can also be HSPs, just to clarify that. But there's a big crossover, obviously, with introversion. And being an HSP basically means that you are it's not that you are emotionally very sensitive, like, oh, you're so sensitive, Sarah, which as an introvert, I was always told as a child. That's always a sure sign that you're an introvert, is that when you were a kid, people said, oh, stop being so sensitive. It's just because you were overstimulated and didn't want to be there. You wanted to be in your room reading, or, you didn't want to be forced out to play with the other kids. That doesn't mean that you're being emotional. It means that your system is more sensitive to sensory inputs like bright lights and loud noises and stimulating energy. Like you walk in a room and it's just a very high energy. It's more things like that. So when I was talking earlier around when I was recovering from my brain surgery and I couldn't be in the farmer's market because all of these inputs were coming at me, that was something that really exaggerated that HSP nature in me. And I feel like that still remains to some degree. And that's something that really brought HSP to my attention, because I think it's important to note that we are the way that we are, but then things in our lives can exaggerate certain qualities in us. And that's something that I feel like exaggerated that HSP quality in me.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if you're doing the things that are supporting your health, you have a greater tolerance for things. And if you're not doing the things that are supporting your health, it doesn't take as much to then kind of push you overboard.
Exactly. And if you don't have that self-awareness, which is not something that we're ever taught, right? No one teaches you that at school or in life around like, how am I feeling in my body? How is my energy? How is my mental health? And how are certain things affecting that? Awareness is hard to come by, I think, especially when we're young. Maybe it's something that we more grow into. But if we don't have that awareness, it can make us really sick if we're not honoring actually what our body is asking for in that regard, right? Time alone, nice, quiet, calming spaces, one-on-one, deep, genuine conversations. Like, it's very, as you know, Chris, like I talk a lot about burnout in my work, but you know, a lot of people say I'm so burned out, and it's always equated to their job and to work. And that's the classic definition, is that you are overworked, underappreciated, don't have time. Like, it's a bad work situation that takes you into an extreme sense of exhaustion and even like mental health crisis. But I also have this unofficial burnout, which is about introvert burnout, where you are in situations that there's technically nothing wrong with them for most people, but for an introvert, they are going to exhaust you. And if you don't have the self-awareness to go out there and be building in moments to recharge, time alone, the kind of activities that give you energy, then you can often end up in a similar place.
Yeah, totally. And I think, I mean, when I reflect on me, I think part of why I may feel that I'm, I don't know, not so far at the ends of the introvert spectrum is that I've set up my life to cater to how I am best served. And I was doing that in kind of in London, kind of just by chance. And now I do that very intentionally. And so I have an office that's in our garden that I work from on my own for the day. I spend time in nature. I really prioritize sleep. And so I go to bed early.
Yeah.
Like I have set up my life in a way that means that my introvert side is completely nurtured, so that then when I do go out into situations where it can be more taxing, it really doesn't have an impact on me because I've done all the things to create that solid foundation.
Yeah, and you have that safe haven to come back to. Like, you have that knowing that you might go to a wedding where you know nobody, let's just say, and which for an introvert it's kind of overwhelming, but you know, alcohol helps. But if we were to say that let's say it was a conference that you went to and you know nobody knows you, then that's challenging for an introvert. But at least if you go home and you have that safe haven where all the things are as you need them and like them to be, then it's all fine. And what I love is what you're saying is that you have kind of, I doubt that you've built it around the whole fact that you're an introvert. It's just like, I like these things, therefore I'm going to make decisions to make my lifestyle this way, right? I live rurally and I have this office in the garden, and it's just how I like things to be. But your introversion and many other things about you play into that. And the thing that this highlights to me is that as an introvert, it's very easy to just be exhausted all the time and come home from work and not have the energy for anything that you really want to be doing. Like, or you don't even have the energy to think about, what would I really love to be doing right now? Like, what are my passions? But the secret to having all the energy you want as an introvert is to be the introvert that you are, right? And that's something that you have intuitively done, and I have done as well. But that's the rest of the world, the extroverts out there, that the world is built around extroversion. That is the definition of someone who's successful and blah, 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 is someone who's extroverted. The rest of the world is built around them, about getting energy from other people and being social and gregarious and this and this and this. When you're immersed in that your whole life, it's so hard to like step away and do what you have done and what I have done. But that ultimately is the secret to having all the energy that you could possibly need and wants is to be the introvert that you are as much as they are being who they are.
Yeah, definitely. And I think if someone was offered a thought experiment of like design the perfect person or who you'd want to be, a lot of the time you do come up with this fantasy person who, as you say, is gregarious or is the life and soul of the party, or the leading man or woman from films who's loud and brash and witty and kind of takes over a room. But just because that's the fantasy of what people come up with doesn't mean that that's actually what that person really should be doing. And I think once someone can live in a way that is genuinely in accordance with how their body is naturally wired, and they see the benefits of, okay, this is what happened when I do get proper downtime, this is what happens when I do set proper boundaries, that the novelty of trying to be that other person, I don't know, appears more of as a novelty. It doesn't hold the same weight. Like I don't, there's no part of me that wishes like, oh wow, I wish I would be more extroverted. Like I feel very comfortable in how I live my life, and this is how I am. And so I think that is somewhat born out of the fact that I'm living in alignment with how I should be.
Yeah, and then you know, a lot of my work is around and based in the studies around authenticity.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the studies show that those people who are happiest are being themselves, are being authentic in themselves. And so, I mean, it's perfect case study right here is that you have designed this life and lifestyle around what you love to do, and it makes you happy. And why would you want to be any other way?
Yeah. And it's, I mean, even you talked about the being burnt out from seeing clients. Is that like now, in terms of now knowing you're a HSP, knowing you're an introvert, do you limit the amount? Have you got a real limit on the amount of people you see, or was it more about the environment and being in that shop and people hassling you as soon as you come out of the toilet that was more of the problem?
So that whole situation was a big problem. That just outside of nutrition, like that kind of exposure to so many people, and then also it being their problems was a big problem for me or for any introvert. But what I noticed working as a nutritionist, like early on, like we were talking before we started recording, around when you start as a nutritionist, you often just start being a nutritionist. You don't really have a focus of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that's, I like everyone started that way, but then started noticing that there's so much more to guiding someone in their health than just telling them the food that they should eat. Like that's telling someone, you know, avoid these foods, eat more of these, this is the reason why, is all very logical, but that's not why we make decisions.
Yeah.
And that's very much more your expertise now, but I really noticed that I have this tiny piece, like this tiny chunk of information in my role as a nutritionist, which is still a huge, vast amount of information. But why people do certain things is vast. And I just, which is why I kind of stepped away from being a nutritionist, because I saw that there's just so much else that people need help with beyond the specifics of the food that they eat. Because in the most simplistic terms, you can tell give them a meal plan to eat all these things, but if they're not sleeping, if they have sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, nothing's ever going to work.
Yeah.
In the most simplistic of terms, like it's kind of why I evolved out of that work ultimately, is because I saw that I needed so many more skills and there's so much more to this than what I was taught in nutrition school.
Yeah. And the people that are coming to you, are they already saying, like, obviously you're branding yourself as the introvert advocate, like they're already on board with the fact that they're an introvert? Or are you getting people that are like, I'm not sure?
People who come to me typically have a sense that they're an introvert. They don't necessarily know, for example, their Myers-Briggs, which is kind of the classic way to tell your personality type in that regard.
Yeah.
And if anyone wants to learn their Myers-Briggs profile, for example, I'm an INFJ. There's a website called 16 personalities, the number 16 personalities.com. That's a great place to start to figure out where you fall on this spectrum that Chris and I are talking about between extroversion and introversion.
Cool. I will put a link to that in the show notes. I've never done Myers-Briggs. I have no idea what my word salad or letter salad is.
I'd love to hear what you are when you do it. Okay. So they have a sense that they're an introvert, and then once I get talking to them, it's just like so many of their problems are to do with the fact that they're an introvert living in an extroverted world, and they haven't made adjustments in that regard. So that's always the first thing that we do, is just like, okay, let's get everything in alignment for you as an introvert, and then we can go work on making you an introvert who is truly flourishing and doing big things in this world because you're an introvert, not in spite of it.
And what are there certain things that come up again and again, or what are like the one or two or three main things that seem to come up most in terms of why someone's floundering instead of flourishing as an introvert?
I think at work, it's that, how do I encapsulate this? It's that they are unable to set the boundaries that they need to in order to work in a way that works best for them.
Yeah.
Because that's really hard. Sometimes, workplaces can be very political and such. And so setting your workspace up and the way that you arrange your day in a way that works for you as an introvert can be challenging to do in the context of your workplace. And so I really help people just check some of those boxes. First of all, there's big, the low hanging fruit. And then we refine from there. I'm trying to think of what else, just a general sense of malaise and exhaustion that doesn't actually allow you as an introvert to truly think deeply. We really love deep thought. We're in our heads. Our minds are always busy thinking about things very deeply. And so if you're exhausted all the time, it can be really frustrating because it feels like you're living very superficially when your mind loves to be really deep. Yeah. And so it just gives this sense of dissatisfaction because you can't truly be who you are, even within your body, in your head, how you think, because you do not have the energy for it. So if you're just coming home, I talk a lot about coming home from work and all you have the energy to is to sit and binge watch on Netflix. Yeah. Which we all do from time to time. That's fine. But if it's every night, it just becomes something that numbs you. When as an introvert, we really like to think, and that's just blocking that whole part of us.
Do you ever have a situation where someone comes to you where they think they're an introvert and actually it turns out that they're an extrovert? And the reason I ask this is that is something that is, I've had it both ways with clients, but that is definitely something that has happened with me, and especially for someone who's had a long-standing eating disorder, an eating disorder that maybe started when they're in their teenage years, and that becomes very isolating. It affects them in terms of their desire to be around other people, etc. But as they then get better, they actually discover that no, they're not the introvert that they thought they were. And so I'm just wondering, have you come across that in the work that you've done?
I would say that's not uncommon. I work with introverts, but we have to also just have the awareness that there's so much else that feeds into who we are and how we show up in the world. Yeah. Whether that be, for example, the example that you shared just now, but people who have experienced trauma and all different kinds, it all changes how we show up in the world. Yeah. And so a lot of the time, for example, an extrovert who has low self-esteem, poor confidence, is shy, all of these things are possible in extroverts. They're still human beings, that they can appear to be introverted, but what's going on in their head is very, very different around, you're in a big group of people, for example, around a dinner table. An underconfident and shy extrovert is going to have a different sense of self-talk to someone who they're sitting next to, who happens to be an introvert, who is simply sitting back, observing, considering the conversation, and then will have something quite profound to say when they choose to speak, whereas the extrovert is kind of scared to speak or scared of the judgment. But I usually, as a coach, I can tell immediately when I talk to someone based on their energy and how they present themselves, whether they're an introvert or an extrovert.
Okay. And I do, I think there's so many as you said, so many different things that can have an impact on this, whether it be about upbringing, trauma, the state that someone's currently in, etc. And I think really at the core of the work that you're doing, even though it's framed through the lens of being an introvert, is what happened with you as part of going through the experience of having the brain tumor, which is just know thyself, and really is about the self-awareness piece and helping people to start to understand that by pulling on some of the levers that tend to get people to better understand who they really are. So that when you are in a better place where you're well rested, well nourished, are spending your time in a way that feels enjoyable, you start to get a real better sense of, okay, how do I want to be doing things and how do I want to be spending my time?
Yeah. Know thyself and then be thyself, like having the confidence to do that is another big component as well.
And I think I was just going to say, I think Susan Cain, in terms of her book Quiet, I think she gave a lot of people confidence to be an introvert, starting to see that there is a strength to this and there are benefits to this. And I think there have been some critiques of Susan Cain's work in terms of it's looking a lot more at a HSP and calling an introvert, etc. But I do think that there was some really good stuff that came out of that in terms of, as I said, helping introverts to see that this isn't a handicap, that this is really something that is valuable, and in the right set and settings, it's a real strength over an extrovert because you're able to do this thing differently and that thing differently.
Yeah, I mean, Susan basically brought introversion into the mainstream and told us all that there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah,
which is huge. Like even my mom, is this like, oh, they're kind of introverted, as if it's kind of a bad thing. I'm like, yes, awesome, they're introverted. They have I just celebrate it when I have someone who's concerned or like self-conscious about the fact they're an introvert. I'm just like, do you know that you can do all these things that most of the population can't do? You have these skills, like your sense of observing, like your ability to observe people and general situations and environments is far superior to anybody else. Like that thing that you noticed in that person, that flinch in their face when you said something, extroverts don't notice that in the same way. Right? And so when introverts choose to have conversations with the right people and we say something and we realize that it hits badly or not in the way that we intended, we know immediately because we see the body language, we hear the inflection in their voice, we notice how they touch their hair, we notice that didn't land as we hoped it would, and we correct immediately. Whereas an extrovert, it just goes way over their head. And I don't want to generalize here, but just by way of example, like that's something I notice all the time, is that introverts, we have these skills that other people simply don't have. You just have to learn what they are.
Yeah, definitely. Well, look, Sarah, this has been such an enjoyable conversation. I'm really glad that you're doing the work that you are doing in the world, and in a really weird way had the brain tumor and experience that you did because it's taken you on this path.
Yeah, for sure.
So the final thing is, where can people find out more about you if they want to? You can talk about social media or website. I'll put it all in the show notes.
Yeah, so the best place, the hub of everything, is my website. That's introvert-advocate.com. I put all my best stuff in my emails, so that's a good place to sign up. We were talking a lot about energy today. I have a great ebook there that you can get, which is 20 introvert-friendly ways to have more energy, which go way beyond just simply spending time on your own. There's so much more to it. And then on social, on Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, I'm Introvert Advocate, and that's where you can find me.
Perfect. Well, yeah, thank you so much for your time today. This was awesome.
Thanks, Chris, so much.
So that was my conversation with Sarah. I hope you enjoyed it. She really is doing great work in supporting introverts and talking about this topic. As I mentioned at the top, I'm taking on clients again. It's a limited intake and I have just 2 spots left. If you want help with recovery, body image, getting your period back, exercise compulsion, getting out of quasi-recovery, or any of the areas that I cover as part of this show, then please get in contact. You can head over to 7-health.com/help for more information. So that is it for today's show. I'll be back with another episode shortly. Stay safe, and I'll catch you then.